and welcome to yet another episode of the Diplomat Couch, the program where we spotlight embassies, international organizations, and we also profile ambassadors who are based in Zimbabwe. On today's episode, we are joined by the Brazilian ambassador to Zimbabwe, His Excellency Ambassador VILMAR Coutinho. Welcome to the show.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for joining us. When you talk of Brazil, the first thing that comes in mind is the biggest carnival in the world and, of course, football. How has Brazil managed to build these two brands?
Well, we didn't exactly build these two brands. Right? The carnival is a cultural manifestation of Brazil that has been there for almost 2 centuries now. It's a sort of a popular party, celebration, carried out on an annual basis, and it simply caught the attention of the world because of its size. It's colorful, it's bright, it's like joy. So the whole world was sort of, amazed by that spectacle. So that's how it became a sort of a trademark of our country. In the case of football, well, because we were lucky enough to have as one of our greatest players, Pelé, who is considered to this day perhaps the best world football player. And with him, we managed to become 3 times world champions, and then 2 more times afterwards. And then, obviously, this also attached to the country an image which is linked to football in a manner that it is there. So football now is part of what Brazil is as well.
Any other fascinating things about Brazil that we hear of Brazil, we think carnival, soccer. Are there any other things that you would like to highlight about Brazil?
Well, there are many things that could be highlighted about Brazil, which are fascinating. After all, we have, very big territory with very differentiated landscapes. We've got, say, for instance, the largest tropical forest in the world. So things like that. But if I were to pinpoint one characteristic of Brazil, which is fascinating, at least for me it is very fascinating, is the fact that Brazil is a product of a mixture of basically 3 ethnic groups, or 3 big peoples, right? The native Indians, the Africans, and the Europeans. And this blend of the 3 ethnic groups mixing and getting together in our country gives to our culture its sort of a unique characteristic, which is, I would say, unparalleled in the world. And again, it's one of the characteristics that makes what Brazil is.
Yes. There's so much diversity when it comes to Brazil.
Diversity, absolutely, yes, indeed.
And then looking at the Brazilian overview of the economy, what are the major exports, imports, and which are the key sectors of the economy in Brazil?
Well, Brazil has, it's a large country. It's a big country with a big territory and with a big population as well. Our population now stands at more than 200 million people. And therefore, obviously, we have a large and very highly sophisticated economy, which has, for the past 50, 60 years, has known a great degree of industrialization. And in more modern times, obviously, a rise of the services sector, as any modern economy. And we still have a very strong agricultural sector, agribusiness sector. In terms of exports and imports, Brazil today is exporting basically the soybean complex products. That includes oil, cake, and grain, and iron ore, crude oil, meat, bovine meat, and poultry. So these are basically our major export products. And what we import, we basically import fertilizers for our agricultural production, oil products. Brazil has become self-sufficient in oil. When we consider the balance, we export crude oil and we import products, but in the overall balance, we are a net exporter of oil products. and also medicines, chemical products, and machinery. So these are basically what we import.
And the major countries that you trade with as Brazil?
China has become our major trading partner about 10 years ago, and it's still the largest. The United States, which had that position until about 10 years ago, is now our second largest trading partner. Then we have the European Union, if you consider all the European Union countries together. Otherwise, it's Argentina, which comes third as our main trading partner. And funny enough, I mean, the pattern of exports and imports more or less match. The same people, the same countries which are our major clients are also our major suppliers.
Oh, okay. And then Brazil being the 5th largest country in the world by area and among the top 10 largest by population, you mentioned it's about 200 million. How has this benefited the country, and what challenges does it pose for the country?
It's difficult to talk about these things benefiting a country because, I mean, these are facts. I mean, this is a reality that we have to deal with. Brazil has always had a large population, even in former times when the population was not as large as it is today, but it was always one of the most populous countries in the world. So this is a fact that we have to deal with, and that poses a lot of challenges. It's not easy to take care of such a large population and to cater for all its needs. But I mean, it's something that we need to do anyway, because it's a fact. On the other hand, having so many people perhaps gives us sort of a large pool of talents, as we've seen in football, for instance, but also in many other areas.
Yeah, that's true. And then talking about population again, Brazil suffered one of the biggest, highest tolls when it came to COVID-19. How have you managed to recover from that?
Yeah, unfortunately, our performance in terms of fighting the pandemic wasn't perhaps one of the most, one of the best in the world. We had a large number of fatal victims in our country, unfortunately. But since mid-2021, we started a very, very strong campaign of vaccination. And we managed to rein in the pandemic. And we are now, like all other countries, trying to recover from the economic impact that this has caused.
When we get back in the second segment, we are going to talk about the bilateral relations between Brazil and Zimbabwe, and maybe ask the ambassador his two favorite Brazilian tourist destinations and why he chooses those to join us in our second segment. Welcome back to our second segment of the Diplomat Couch, and today we're joined by the Ambassador of Brazil to Zimbabwe, His Excellency VILMAR Coutinho. Before the break, we talked a bit about Brazil, and now we just want to discuss bilateral relations between Brazil and Zimbabwe. Since the establishment of diplomatic relations between Zimbabwe and Brazil, which areas have the two countries cooperated? And maybe you could give us a brief on the results that these bilateral relations have achieved.
Actually, before I go into what we are doing now and what we intend to do in the future, it's useful to have a sort of, historical view of how relations between the two countries developed. To be honest, relations between Brazil and Zimbabwe were almost non-existent, or have been almost non-existent for a long time. It's for historical reasons. As you know, about half of the population of Brazil is of African descent. But the Africans who came to Brazil, or who were forced to go to Brazil in a chapter of our history, which is not perhaps the most the happiest. But they came basically from Western African countries, right? In West Africa, Nigeria, Cameroon, Angola, Ghana. So they came from there. They didn't come from this region. So historically, the two countries almost had no contacts. This was British colonization, ours was Portuguese colonization, so we were very much apart. It was only when Zimbabwe became independent that Brazil was among the first countries to recognize its independence, and it was also among the first to open an embassy in Harare. And at the time there was hope that, well, finally the opportunity shows up for us to get closer and improve our relations. But then unfortunately Zimbabwe faced a number of problems throughout its history, and that somehow, let's say, pushed in time the idea of making a true effort to deepen relations between the two countries. Now we are finally at the stage where things are appropriate, are propitious for that. We have a new president in Brazil who, well, he's not exactly new, he's back in power. And when he was in power for the first time, he had a very strong Africa policy. So his idea was that Brazil had to come closer to Africa and have good relations with African countries. And therefore, now he's back and he is willing to revive that kind of policy. So now it's the appropriate time for that. The areas in which we foresee major or best opportunities for our two countries to cooperate are in agriculture and mining, because these are two very important sectors in both countries.
Which areas do you think the two countries will deepen their cooperation in the future? You said agriculture and mining. Maybe if you'd like to...
Yeah, it's basically these two. Well, actually in agriculture we already have two bilateral cooperation projects in execution. One of them in the area of cotton production, the other one in the area of cattle breeding for the production of meat. And you see, these are the two pioneering projects. Our idea is to have a few more projects in agricultural areas to see if we can establish also a deep cooperation in terms of agricultural research. And for the mining sector, we still have to explore the opportunities. But as I say, being in this sector very important in the two countries, and also the two countries having very important small-scale producers in the mining sector, that also potentially offers a number of opportunities for cooperation.
Okay. And then in the areas of business, sport, and educational exchange, maybe I can even add cultural exchange programs between the two countries. Are there anything that are in the plans?
So far we don't have anything, but we are planning, yes, we are planning, and I've already had a few initial contacts with Zimbabwean authorities about that, to see if we can make an effort to make the use of Portuguese more widespread in Zimbabwe, and therefore also letting the Zimbabwean people know more about our culture.
A few years ago, the Zimbabwe Tourism Authority, I think they brought in a Brazilian entourage and there was a carnival. Any plans of that?
Oh yeah, definitely.
Happening
well,
again?
you see, as I say, I've arrived recently in the country. I've been in the country for only 9 months now. And my mission is for 3 years, and I hope to actually to be a little bit longer than that. So this is in my plans. Yes, I would like very much to develop actions in that field with collaboration with Zimbabwean authorities. As I say, to bring cultural manifestations like that to Harare, to Zimbabwe in the next few years.
And then on the international scene, how has the Ukraine war affected BRICS, and how are your relations with other countries, like, for example, Russia, during the Ukraine-Russia conflict?
Well, unfortunately, the war, which should not have happened, but unfortunately it is there, and it has affected BRICS for the simple fact that one of the countries directly involved in the war is one of the BRICS countries. This has certainly not affected our relations with Russia, definitely not. We made a point to the Russians that we condemned the invasion of the Ukrainian territory at the United Nations because we feel that sovereignty and territorial integrity of all states must be respected. But we also understand that Russia felt that its security was at risk. What we would like to see is an effort by all countries to bring this war to an end as soon as possible. that would be the best for all of us.
Thank you for that. And on that serious note, discussing the Russia-Ukraine war, hopefully when we come back in the third segment, we're taking it lighter, where we're going to talk about His Excellency the Ambassador's personal life and his time here in Zimbabwe. Join us in the third and final segment of the Diplomat Couch. Hello and welcome back to our third and final segment of the Diplomat Couch. And now we're going to discuss about you, Your Excellency. So who is Ambassador Coutinho? Where were you born? Where did you grow up? And where were you educated?
I was born in the city of Santos in Brazil. I had a sort of a very peculiar life in my childhood. My father was working for an international company, so I lived in several countries with him. That is perhaps one of the reasons why I decided to become a diplomat.
I was about to say.
And then obviously afterwards in the career, I've been now for 40 years in the service. And so, as you can imagine, I've been to several countries. I've got a lot of experience in this business.
So the influence, I was going to say, the influence of being a diplomat came from your childhood, basically.
It did, definitely.
Okay.
The idea of traveling a lot, getting to know other countries, living in other countries, I mean, that was fascinating for me since I was a child.
And then what have been the highlights of your career as a diplomat?
Well, I worked for a long time with issues related to Mercosur, which is the regional South American SADC. I mean, it's sort of a national group in our continent. And I worked a long time with that. I was also posted in Cuba as number 2 of the embassy, which was a very interesting experience as well. And one of the interesting things about my career is that I had a long experience in Africa. Actually, this is my 6th country in Africa, in the service.
Okay.
Plus one more that I had lived before as a child with my parents.
Oh.
So this was Angola, where I lived when I was a child. And then in the service, I was in Algeria, South Africa, Cote d'Ivoire, Mali, São Tomé and Príncipe, and now Zimbabwe.
Is Zimbabwe your favorite?
Well, actually, Zimbabwe, I asked to be placed here. See, a couple of years back, I lived in South Africa. Oh, I think I forgot to mention South Africa in that list.
No, you did.
I did.
Yes.
Oh, right, great. I had lived in South Africa, and at the time I was there, we visited Zimbabwe. We came by car, we visited the country, went around to Victoria Falls, to Harare, to the Great Zimbabwe, and so we knew the country. We knew more or less the country. We also knew that it was similar in many aspects to living in South Africa. And we had also lived in London, in Britain. So we knew that some characteristics about Zimbabwe would also remind us of our times in Britain. So when the time came for my previous mission to end, I specifically asked to be posted to Zimbabwe. I knew that my predecessor was about to reach the retirement age, so that they would need to replace the ambassador in Zimbabwe anyway. And I said, I want specifically that posting. And they gave me, so I'm very happy about it. I couldn't be happier than that.
And I hope Zimbabwe lives up to its expectations.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely.
So
as I say, I mean, as we arrived, we looked around and I said, well, I mean, this is very familiar to everything that we knew from South Africa and from Britain, so it's very familiar. But there was one point which really caught our attention, which perhaps didn't catch our attention so much when we visited the country about 20 years ago, is how nice the people are here. How nice and communicative and relaxed people seem to be here. So this was something that we were really very surprised that everyone we address here treats us as very, very well, very sympathetically, very nice. And everybody, every foreigner here I've met talks about it. It's something that has caught not only my attention, but a lot of foreign people's attention.
That's true. I think it's also a pride for us as Zimbabweans to say we are one of the friendliest nations in the world. And besides those highlights, what else have you found fascinating about your stay in Zimbabwe?
Well, Harare is a very nice city, very pleasant city, very similar to the city of Brasilia, the capital of Brazil, where we live when we are in Brasilia, and in Brazil. So this also makes it easier for us to
live here. And then, since you came to Zimbabwe 9 months ago, have you visited the tourist sites around Zimbabwe?
No, not yet.
Not
yet, because we didn't have the opportunity. Soon after we arrived here, we had to go to Brazil because it was election time. So we went there, and we came back. So really, we've been really in the country only since December. So we didn't have much time to visit the tourist areas, but we have plenty of time for us.
And I'm sure you've mentioned Victoria Falls, you've mentioned Great Zimbabwe, and maybe I'll take you back to Brazil. Which are your favorite tourist destinations in Brazil, and why are those your favorite?
Well, look, I mean, that is a very difficult question because being so large, the country offers so much for tourism, so much, that it is difficult to pinpoint just two. I would need to pinpoint at least 10 in order to be fair. But still, for somebody who hasn't been to Brazil, who hasn't ever had an opportunity to visit Brazil, I would mention two things which are, say, sort of things that are musts if you visit Brazil. One of them is the Amazon forest, of course. And this is something that a lot of people have no clue, no idea of what the forest really is. And so I would recommend a visit to the Amazon region because it's also something very important for the world, not only for Brazil. And the second, the city of Rio de Janeiro, which is a big city with urban, nice, beautiful urban beaches. And so making it perhaps one of the most beautiful cities in the world. And that's where Carnival, that you mentioned at the beginning of the program, happens. I mean, the best Carnival show in Brazil and probably on earth is the one from Rio de Janeiro. So
and which time of the year does the Carnival? In February?
February.
Okay. Is this the summer?
It's also summer in Brazil, so it's very warm, and so it's an ideal time to visit Brazil.
No, thank you very much for your time and for everything you've shared, joining us on the Diplomat Couch. It's been a pleasure having you, Your Excellency. And that's our episode for today on the Diplomat Couch. My name is Osli Matsikenyeri. Thank you for joining us.